What's going on, everyone? It's Ben from YGO from Zero, back with another retro Yu-Gi-Oh video, and this is going to be one going through the card pool, or the new additions to the card pool for the next format that I'm going to be covering, Chaos Return format. Now, Chaos Return format's very interesting format. Took place after Reaper format, being based around the SJC Indianapolis in 2006, August of 2006 to be exact. And if that sounds somewhat familiar to you, it might be because GOAT format is based around the August 2005 SJC Indianapolis. This is 1 year after GOAT format, so it's kind of cool to see how the game evolved, from GOAT to this format. Sort of like a 1 year later sort of thing. So I think that's pretty cool. But also, since we've covered Cyber format and Reaper format in between GOAT format and Chaos Return format, it's also cool to sort of see the incremental steps and what this format does to try and rein in the power of Reaper format. Because Reaper format, it's not the most high power format overall, compared to like Chaos Turbo and GOAT. It's probably a bit underpowered compared to that. But you do have things like Cyber Dino Decay running around pretty rampantly. And that is a bit of a problem for a lot of people playing Reaper format. So, with Chaos Return format, we got a new ban list instituted in April 2006. And so that sort of reined in some aspects of Dino Decay and made it less of a threat. It's still a threat for sure, but it's less of what it was in Reaper. In addition, there were new cards added from Enemy of Justice and some assorted structure decks and promos, so I'll be going through those as well in this video. But before we get into the new cards added to the card pool, we got to go through the limited list, or the ban list, that is. I'm still used to calling it limited list from all the limited lists in the DM era, but we've got cards banned, and those are the cards on screen right here. In April 2006, there weren't like too many major additions to the ban list part of this, so I'm just going to go through the entire thing, just talk about each card here. So firstly, the cards that were already on the ban list. We've got BLS, Black Lotus Soldier Envoy at the beginning here, and Chaos Emperor Dragon Envoy at the end. Two very powerful boss monsters for Chaos. Getting these out of the format is very nice. It allows other decks that aren't Chaos to potentially shine in the future. A new additional list is Cyberjar. Cyberjar, a very explosive flip monster, and so taking this out of the format both reduces the power of Empty Jar, which, the last list did try to hit, but not really with the right cards, in my opinion. So this list is trying to adjust what it banned to limit the power of that strategy. So it banned Cyberjar here, and Cyberjar is a powerful card in general, so it makes sense that this thing is getting hit. Fiberjar, of course, is also already on the list because this card just, dragged out games a bit too long, so it makes sense why this is hit here. Magical Scientist, very, very powerful card to turbo out a bunch of fusion monsters, potentially FTK with it, so this thing is banned. You got Mikura banned here as well. The errata on screen here is not the original effect of Mikura. When, Mikura was first released, it could just, once it's sent to the graveyard, period, not just from the monster zone, you could activate as many traps as you want from your hand for the rest of the turn. So that enabled a variety of FTKs, so this thing got hit for that reason. We got Sinister Serpent here as a recurring value. It's good to get this thing banned because just having a card that keeps coming back like that can be a bit annoying. And we'll potentially see another card that does something somewhat similar also get hit later on this list. We got Tri-Infected Virus here. Of course, it's most abusable with Sinister Serpent, but it's still very powerful even if you don't have the Serpent there. Just acting the board wipe for the low cost of one card from your hand is pretty strong. We've got a Witch of the Black Forest here, which can search out a variety of powerful monsters, so it makes sense why they hit this. And lastly, Yatagarasu, which can lock down the game if you're able to set up its effect. And, for that reason, because they want to actually have games not just end in a draw lock, they ban this card, which I do think makes sense. For the spells, of course, we've got the original Power 5, Pot of Greed, Change of Heart, Raigeki, and Monster Reborn, along with Dark Hole. Dark Hole was, limited in Reaper format, so it did come off the ban cards here. But I think they, sort of saw from that, they're like, okay, well, we don't want just a board wipe in the format, even though it is somewhat balanced because it wipes your own monsters as well. Oftentimes, you're just using this when you have no monster on your side of the field, and that's just very strong, basically turning it into a one-sided board wipe. So they took this thing out of the format. For the hand rips, there's Delinquent Duo and Forceful Sentry. For some reason, after a format, with Comfy legal, they were like, yeah, Comfy's still fine. Let's just keep it there. So Comfy is indeed still legal in Chaos Return format. And that's a bit annoying, but I do think that it's ultimately fine. It's a 1-for-1 trade, so it's not the worst thing in the world. And honestly, I do think that Trap Death Shoot is more toxic than, honestly, any of these spell hand rips here. And that's still at 3 copies. So that's the bigger issue for me. But Comfy can just be a feels bad card because, it does cost 1,000 like Duo, but it does give you full knowledge of the hand. And it does, allow you to pick a card out of the hand to send to the graveyard there. So it's kind of frustrating that that's in the format, but that's just how it is. And, as players of the DM era know that, these hand rips being in the format don't necessarily ruin the format. So, keep an open mind. For the other spells of Painful Choice here, this can set up a lot of degenerate stuff, especially with Chaos, just setting up a Light and Dark package in Graveyard for that, and also getting a powerful card to hand, which is very, very strong. Harpy Feather Duster to wipe away your opponent's entire back row. Having a one-sided complete removal of back row like this is just too powerful for this format. Mirage Nightmare, because this card can draw you into so many things or just cycle through your deck. Very, very strong card here. And a Butterfly Dagger Elma for weird FTK shenanigans. I don't necessarily think that this card is that good to be on this list, but it does make sense. Even if it's not the most consistent thing in the world, promoting those sorts of decks existing in the format is not necessarily the healthiest thing out there. So it makes sense why this got hit. For the traps now, we've got some more FDK enablers. A new card on the list, Exchange the Spirit. This was legal at 1 in Reaper format, but, I guess they decided, okay, well, this thing existing in the format just breeds degenerate strategies, so we don't necessarily want to include this here. So they banned it along with Last Turn, which I do think is also a new inclusion there. Last Turn decks were potentially something you could play in Reaper format. They weren't the best thing in the world, but again, promoting the existence of decks that do degenerate things like that is not necessarily a good thing. So banning this card, I think, does make sense. It's good to see those cards gone. The other traps make a bit more sense here, or not make a bit more sense, but they're a bit more just generically powerful. We got Imperial Order to shut off spells, which is just so strong, as anyone who's played a DM era format with it knows. We've got Ring of Destruction here, which can blow up an opponent's monster or your own monster and deal damage to your opponent and you, equal to that monster's attack. And, this was not eroded back at the time, so there were a lot less restrictions on it, and it can be a very powerful way to end games. So it's probably good that this thing is gone, as it's a bit too strong for the format at the time. And lastly, we've got Time Seal. This is just for, basically Time Seal looping shenanigans. So there were certain decks that could play, Mask of Darkness and Tsukiyomi, and basically you just use Mask of Darkness, keep getting back Time Seal, keep preventing your opponent from drawing, and it's sort of like a do-it-yourself Yadalock. So it's not, as good as the Yadalock, but, it's still something that could exist. And again, getting rid of cards that promote degenerate strategies is probably a good thing. So it makes sense why this thing is gone. But that's going to do it for the banned cards. Now let's move on to the limited cards. Now again, just like much of the ban list, much of the limited list was already here in the last format, but there are some notable new additions that I do want to cover, and it's just good to cover all these cards in general. So first up, we got the pieces of Exodia, Exodia the Forbidden One, and then all the left legs, left arms, right arms, etc. So, this is more here for lore reasons. If you did make it at 3, I think this format's evolved to a point where you wouldn't necessarily want to play all 3 copies in your deck, even for, greater consistency in drawing these things. But even at 1, I don't really think this card is, that good. It's a neat strategy you can go for, but it's mainly here for lore reasons. So I like that it's here for lore reasons, so I don't object to it being on the list. But it is something you can try and play if you want to. Confiscation really messes it up, but things like Pot of Avarice or something could potentially get these things back. So I don't know, maybe there's something there if you want to go for it. For the more generically good cards on this list, firstly, we've got Brave the Magical Warrior, just a good beat stick that can pop your opponent's back row, very strong. We got DD Assailant. This is a new addition to the list, much like DD Warrior Lady is on the list here. It can do a very similar thing. It can get aggressive, banish an opponent's threat, so it's probably just good to limit this card, just like DD Warrior Lady is limited here. And continuing the Warrior Toolbox, we've also got Exiled Force here, which was here before. Still a very, very powerful card. You can search off Rhoda, and even off Sangan as well. There are many ways to search into this, and it's just very, very good to proactively pop your opponent's stuff. Injection Fairy Lily here as well, very powerful monster to get in for basically 3,400 damage, and that's a lot of damage at this time in the game. You got Sangan here to search out a variety of cards in our deck. This card being limited as opposed to Witch does make sense, as lower attack point monsters are, they're very powerful, don't get me wrong, but compared to Witch being able to search out beaters, that gets things more aggressive. So it makes sense by Sangan is just limited here as opposed to banned, as opposed to Witch there. For the other cards that Sangan might search out, we've got a new inclusion on the list in the form of Mask of Darkness. This is sort of limited for the same sort of reason that I mentioned with the Time Seal loop. You can do sort of other loops with Mask of Darkness like that. So it makes sense why they limited it. Again, it's just to, sort of disincentivize people from playing degenerate strategies, not necessarily because this thing was a tier 1 or tier 0 meta threat, right? We've got Morphing Jar and Night Assailant as well. These are here. Night Assailant's here because if you have 2, you can do the loop with it, which is very strong because it wasn't eroded like this at the time. So you could actually do more degenerate things with it, or to set up a better resource loop like you see in GOAT format. Morphing Jar is mainly here, I think, for Empty Jar. Again, they tried to hit Empty Jar and now they banned Cyber Jar, but Morphing Jar is still, relatively good here in the limited section. We got Tsukiyomi, which can be used to reset our flips and then flip it up. This is more a casualty of Goat Control, which got hit on the last list, and some of the cards that got hit for it are still here. So I think Souk mainly falls into that, but again, there are things you can do with like Mask of Darkness or just other degenerate loops that you can do with Souk. So it does make sense why this thing is somewhat hit. There are also a bunch of powerful tribute monsters on this list as well. Dark Magician of Chaos, very strong monster, not just to tribute out, but also to go into off something like Monster Gate or Reasoning or something like that. So good to have this card at 1. At 3 would be a bit much. We got a Jinzo here as well, just a very powerful tribute that shuts off all traps. Basically, like when you have a card in the game that shuts off all of one type of card, it generally can be a problem, and so it makes sense why this thing is limited. We've also got Sacred Phoenix Nephthys, which is a very sticky monster that can just stay on field and be very annoying to deal with, so it makes sense why this thing's limited to 1 copy. You can also turbo it out with something like Hand of Nephthys, so, it's not the hardest thing to access, even though it is a level 8 here. And if you want to go into any of these tribute monsters, you've also got Treeborn Frog here, which is sort of the, annoying thing that keeps coming back that I mentioned earlier when I talked about Sinister Serpent. This thing was unlimited in Reaper format and saw a ton of play, so it makes sense why this thing is limited to 1. And in this format, there aren't as many ways to turbo into the graveyard. Like, if you're familiar with future formats, you know about Swap Frog, you know about Foolish Burial, etc. None of that really exists in this format. You can do, like, multiple Mother Grizzlies to get into this thing, but that does require a commitment in your deck, and so I think that this thing is relatively fine at 1 copy. If you do want to go into that sort of turbo package, then you can definitely do that, but that's sort of like a deck building decision that I think leads to more interesting deck building and what you want to prioritize. So I do like this thing limited to 1 copy in this format. Next up, we've got Twin-Headed Behemoth. This is mainly here for just a rulings issue where, like, the original wording of the card was written a bit confusingly, where, like, if it gets shuffled back into the deck and you're playing multiple copies of it, how do you know which one has used its effect or not? And so that can get kind of weird because this wasn't just, like, they didn't really have, like, hard once per duel sort of effects at the time, or they didn't have, like, a reasonable way to talk about it or rule it in a way that made it clear to everyone involved, so that's why this thing was limited. But we've got Protector of the Sanctuary, the last limited monster here. This is mainly here for just, there were certain degenerate strategies you could potentially set up with this thing. Like if you Call of the Haunted after activating a card destruction, and you bring this back, card destruction, pitch your opponent's entire hand, they can't draw. That's kind of neat. But it is a very convoluted combo to bring out. But again, it's sort of one of those things where they try and hit this thing to prevent people from making a degenerate deck out of it. I said this with the last monster, but there is technically one more monster. It's just a fusion monster, and that's Thousand Eyes Restrict. Is mainly here because you're hitting Goat Control, so it makes sense to limit this thing to 1. Although it doesn't really make sense because you're also limiting, like, Metamorphosis and Scapegoat here as well. And realistically, if these things are limited, you don't really have too many ways to get into a second one of them. You can do, like, Magician of Faith to get one of these back and then go into another Thousand Eyes Restrict. But, like, if you're doing all that investment, you probably deserve to have another Thousand Eyes Restrict out. So I think this card probably could have not been limited, but it is limited here. And again, this is sort of like the casualties of Goat Control. Moving on to these spells, we've got a very surprising limit here, which is Graceful Charity. This card was banned in the last format. They decide, you know what, maybe it's not a problem. Let's bring it back to 1. And that is just such a shocking change to the list, because this card is one of the most broken cards in the game. But I guess they're like, well, if every deck has access to it, it can't be that bad. So this card's back. It is a very powerful card, and you will see pretty much every deck playing it. But it is very, very good to know about. And it's just like, why did they bring this back? Why would they do this? I don't necessarily know what they were thinking when they did this. It's just what they did. Moving on to some of the other cards that were already limited, we've got Confiscation here. Again, I mentioned this in the ban section of the list. This card's just around. You got to deal with it. It is what it is. Certain formats have these cards like this that people don't like, but, you just sort of got to play around it. You got Card Destruction here as well. Again, more of a hit against Empty Jar or just Degenerate Deck to try and loop this to deck you out, so it does make sense why it's on this list. You got Heavy Storm and Mystical Space Typhoon for spell and trap removal, which, I think that makes sense to limit the amount of spell trap removal available, or the easy ones. Like Death Tornado is something that you could play potentially at 3 copies, but because you have to set it for a turn, it's, like, less powerful than these. I mean, not, like, too much less powerful than MST, but it is still less powerful enough to make sense. And so it makes sense why these two are both limited here. And also, they can both hit a variety of cards in the next section of these spells of the limited list. Just cards that stick around, like Sword of Revealing Light. In the newly limited Level Limit Area B, this thing was semi-limited in Reaper format. Now it's finally limited. I think that's a good thing. Limiting the Floodgates makes a lot of sense to me. But, I'm sure that all the stall players out there are pretty upset about this. But don't worry, there are other things that you can do, other degenerate Floodgates that the format introduces, which I'll get into when I go over the card pool. We've also got equipped cards like Snatch Steal, very, very strong card in this format to take your opponent's thing and get aggressive. We got Premature Burial to bring back your stuff from the graveyard. We get United We Stand and Mage Power to buff up your opponent, or not your opponent's monsters, but your monsters to great heights, and that's why these things are banned here. We also got Limiter Removal for a similar reason, like Machine OTK is a thing you can do. You can use like Cyberstein to bring out like Cyber End Dragon, and then Limiter Removal up to huge heights, so it makes sense why this thing is limited. And it also makes sense, speaking of Spine OTK, this new limit here, Last Will. Last Will was at 3 in Reaper format, and it led to Steiner TK being one of the best decks in the format. Limiting Last Will does help against that quite a bit. Now, I'm not going to say like Steiner TK is not a good strategy still, because I do think it is still good, and you can just up the number of Steins that you play. But limiting Last Will really restricts the power of something like Stein Monarch, so I think it's good that this thing was limited. We also got Metamorphosis and Scapegoat, again, casualties of the GOAT control deck, so it makes sense why these things are both hit. We got Lightning Vortex, which is just a board wipe, so it makes sense why this thing is limited. Even though there are ways to play around it because it only destroys all face-up cards, it probably is better to just limit a board wipe that you have, right? And not every deck plays Lightning Vortex either, but the ones that can play it are very powerful with it. So we've got Book of Moon here as well to flip down your opponent's stuff or your stuff. You know, this is a very, very flexible card, so it makes sense why it's hit here. Although I think the original reason why it was hit was maybe because of Empty Jar. But either way, it's still a very, very strong card, so it makes sense why it's limited. And next up for the last spell on the limited list, we've got Pot of Avarice here. Pot of Avarice is a card that not every deck can play, but the decks that can play it gives quite a boost to. So it makes sense why this thing is limited. For the traps, we got Mirror Force back on the limited list. So I think that's really good because I think this card is actually pretty healthy for a format. It is a board wipe, but it's a board wipe that you can play around. So I think that's very, healthy and promotes good play. So I like this thing back to 1. For the other trap board wipe, we get TT here. This thing was limited last format as well. So it's still pretty good. I mean, honestly, most of these traps were limited last format as well. You get Call the Han to bring your stuff back. Ceasefire and Magic Cylinder for burn, but Ceasefire can also be used as sort of an anti-flip strategy side. So that's pretty good as well. We got Reckless Greed for combo decks. But the new trap added here was Drop Off, which I think is mainly here. Again, just like with stuff like Mask of Darkness, there are weird degenerate loops you can do with this thing. Like if you Mask of Darkness loop back the Drop Off, you can just keep Drop Offing your opponent's draws every turn. This isn't necessarily as good as like Time Seal because, things like Treeborn Frog exist or other things that are good in Graveyard. So it's not as debilitating, but it can still be very annoying if it goes off. So it makes sense why this thing was limited as well. That's going to do it for the limited list, or the limited section of the list, that is. Let's dive into the semi-limits before diving into the new additions to the card pool. Now we get to the semi-limited list. Now, the semi-limited list throughout the game's history has sort of had a weird position. It's kind of like a holding cell for, cards that they think might be able to come back, but, maybe can't. It's also a holding cell for cards that, are very specific in the fact that their effects make them broken at 3 copies, but not at 2. Of course, we don't really have many of those in the game at this point, but that will be what the game eventually evolves to. But it can also be a point just like, if you give a deck 3 of a card, maybe it's too consistent, so you try and limit it to 2 because it's not quite strong enough to be limited to 1. It's a weird sort of position for cards to be in on the semi list, but it is a fact of the game, and it's something in almost every format, so it is good to know about, and so we will be going through it here. So firstly, we've got the only new card on this list that was brought from unlimited to semi-limited, and that's Apprentice Magician. Now, there are a couple different reasons why this card could be on the list. I think it's mainly on the list because they switched Magician of Faith from being limited to unlimited. Or not limited to unlimited, but limited to semi-limited. So basically, if you have Apprentice Magician, which can go into Magician of Faith, maybe they felt that having this at 3 and Magician of Faith at 2 would be too strong, so they decided to semi-limit this down to 2. But either way, I don't think this affects things like too much. It makes Apprentice Magician slightly worse, but like not noticeably worse if you're playing an Apprentice Magician deck. And, speaking of Magician of Faith at 2, it is indeed at 2 now, so that makes it a little bit more easily able to recycle spells and stuff, so that is somewhat nice, but I don't think it will change things like too much. This thing being 1 or 2, it doesn't really affect decks too much, but maybe that will be something that affects the format quite a bit, so we'll have to explore and see. But for the other cards in the semi-limited list here, you got Manticore of Darkness. This thing has been here basically since it came out because you can do weird loops with this stuff, so semi-limiting it is pretty good in that regard. We got Reflect Boundary. This thing has been limited for a long time, but I think they put it to 2 because they're like, well, okay, does this thing really need to be on this limited list? Probably not, but, we don't want to just make it like completely unlimited, so we're going to bring it to 2 copies just to check. We've got Creature Swap here at 2. Emergency Providence at 2 as well. These things have been at 2 for a while. And the new card on this list here as well is Nobleman of Crossout. This thing was limited after being semi-limited for quite some time. But now I think they're like, well, okay, we're bringing back more Magician of Faith, so maybe we need to bump this up to 2 as well. I don't know exactly the reason why they're shuffling around between limited and non-limited, but that's just how they're doing it. We got a Reinforced the Army. This thing's been at 2 for quite some time as well, and Upstart Goblin at 2 as well. For the traps, the new trap in the semi-limited section is Deck Devastation Virus. This thing was limited, but they brought it back to 2. I'm not quite sure why they brought it back to 2, as there is a deck that got more powerful with the new limited list, namely Dark World, that can take advantage of Deck Devastation Virus. So maybe they weren't thinking about that. Maybe they're just like, well, Dark World isn't really that good anyway, so they need the boost. But either way, I'm kind of surprised that they brought this to 2, as it can be somewhat degenerate. But, you know, I don't know. We'll have to see if it's actually any good in this format or not. For the other traps, to get good Goblin Housekeeping, that this can do, like, you know, weird stacking things if you have 3, I guess. I don't know. If you're semi-limiting it, you might as well either unlimit it or limit it completely, because I don't think this card's that good. But, you know, it is on the semi-limited list here because it can potentially stack, I guess. And lastly, we got Gravity Bind. This was always at 2 for quite some time. And, you know, it's still at 2 here. So they limited the level limit area B. I guess they're like, we need to at least allow stall mill, or not stall mill, but just stall decks in general with something. So we'll give them 2 Gravity Bind. Maybe that will make up for limiting level limit. But for the unlimited cards, there were some new cards that were taken off the list entirely. The first one being Abyss Soldier. This thing was semi-limited, but they finally took it off the list entirely. Maybe because there's only one Treeborn Frog in the format now. They don't really care as much about this thing. I don't know, but here it is in unlimited glory. And lastly, we got Book of Tayu. This thing was limited, in fact. So they just skipped the semi-limited holding cell entirely to unlimit this thing. And I think that's mainly because they did other hits to Empty Jar, as I've mentioned. And this card is mainly just a card used in Empty Jar to combo. So that's going to do it for the semi-limited list and the ban list in general. But we can't just dive into Chaos Return as is. You know, we got to discuss the new cards added, because there were actually some new cards that do impact the format quite a bit. So let's dive into those. And then after this video, we'll be ready to dive into Chaos Return format proper. Now, because there was only a brief bit of time between Reaper format and Chaos Return format, there weren't too many new additions to the card pool. There was, in fact, only one core booster set added to the card pool, but there were a variety of promos as well. So let's discuss the promos before diving into the new card pack itself, because that card pack does tie into some of the promos here. So I figured it'd just be better to talk about the promos first. Firstly, we've got a prize card, one of the most powerful prize cards of the era, which is Shrink. This is a quick play spell. It says target one face-up monster on the field. Its original attack becomes halved until the end of this turn. Now, this thing may not seem too crazy, and to be fair, it's not quite as crazy as something like Crush Card Virus or Cyberstein or some of the other, like, just busted prize cards that you pick up or think of at the time. But I do think that this card is still very good. It's a neat battle trap. You can use it on your turn. There's a variety of uses for this card, and it gets even better when other strategies come out that can really abuse it, things like gadgets. So I do like this card, and, you know, I do think it is worth potentially knowing about if you want to play it in this format, because it can come up in a variety of situations. Next up, we've got the cards that probably won't do anything in the meta. We got Magical Arm Shield. This is a normal trap. It says when an opponent's monster declares an attack while they control 2 or more face-up monsters and you control a monster, target one face-up monster your opponent controls except the attacking monster. Take control of that face-up monster until the end of the battle phase, and if you do, change the attack target to it and perform damage calculation. Really strange card, but it comes from the anime, so, you know, it kind of goes with the territory there. But still, neat card. I don't think this card's worth playing in pretty much any situation, but it is very funny, and if you do ever pull it off on your opponent, I mean, that would be really, really fun to see. So cool to see this card around now. And speaking of the anime, we also have this trio of anime-based cards here, which are kind of neat, although they're not really that good. First is Unity. This is a quick play spell that says select one monster on your side of the field. The defense of the selected monster becomes equal to the combined original defense of all face-up monsters on your side of the field until the end of this turn. The idea is if you've got a defense position monster and your opponent's attacking into it, you activate Unity, it gets buffed up to a large number of defense, and your opponent takes some damage. And that's kind of neat, but, like, I don't know. I feel like Woboku's just generally better for this sort of thing. Protects your monster either way. And while it doesn't deal damage, it's still fine. I mean, honestly, Magic Cylinder would probably be better than this. But I guess this is unlimited, where Magic Cylinder is limited. And also, I guess there's a quick play spell, so if your opponent does use spell and trap removal on it, you can chain it to protect your monster. But I don't know. This card just seems like pretty bad. I don't really think there's a deck that really wants to play this that much, but it's kind of neat. I guess there is a deck that might want to play it, which we'll get to in a second. But, you know, I think overall this card won't really see much play. Next, we got Yujo Friendship. This is a normal spell that says offer your opponent a handshake. If they accept your handshake, each player's life points become half the combined life points of both players. If you have Unity in your hand and you show it to your opponent, they must accept the handshake. Now, of course, if you play online, which, a lot of the, duels on the channel that I show off, they all happen online. If you play this card, basically, you can't actually offer your opponent a handshake. So you've just got to be like, okay, do you accept a handshake or not accept the handshake, like virtually, basically? And then your opponent just says yes or no, right? So you can't, unfortunately, do the iconic, strat of just having a very, very filthy hand and, basically being like, oh, I won't accept your handshake or something. Although, realistically, that doesn't really make sense for this card. Like, you would have to be having a really filthy hand as just, like, counterplay to this card because, you actually want your opponent to accept the handshake if you activate this card. So, yeah, so I guess you'd have to, like, as the opponent, have had the read that Yujo Friendship is in the opponent's deck or, like, it's in the meta somewhere, and you just, like, filthy up your hands beforehand to make them really not want to handshake with you. But you also just have the option to not accept the handshake. Although I guess this disincentivize your opponent if they try and force you to handshake with Unity in hand. It didn't incentivize them from doing that. But, like, this card doesn't even have a strong enough effect to really make it worth it. Like, I don't know. This card is just not good anyways. So, it's just sort of like a funny joke about the handshake meta thing. But, like, realistically, that doesn't hold up to scrutiny here. But if you do play these cards, you actually have access to a very powerful trap card in Judgment of the Pharaoh. This is a normal trap that says pay half your life points, select and activate an appropriate effect which can be applied. 1. If Yujo Friendship is in your graveyard until the end of this turn, your opponent cannot normal summon, set, flip summon, or special summon a monster or monsters, or activate an effect monster's effect. And 2. If Unity is in graveyard until the end of your turn, or the end of this turn, negate the effects of all spell and trap cards on your opponent's side of the field, and your opponent cannot activate or set spell and trap cards. That is kind of busted. You're basically locking your opponent out of using either monsters or spells or traps for a turn. And that's kind of wild. So, I could potentially see someone playing a deck, with Judgment of the Pharaoh, Yujo Friendship, and Unity. Maybe something like Magical Hats as well, just to turbo these things out of their deck into the graveyard. And then you've got Judgment of the Pharaoh basically to lock down your opponent for a turn. That's kind of neat. Like, not going to lie. But I think that's a bit too much of a pie in the sky sort of jank strategy to actually work. But it is something that you can potentially try and do, which would be very funny. So I'm very curious to see if anyone will actually try that. But speaking of the anime, there's one last anime card here, which is Mesmeric Control, the normal spell that says your opponent cannot change the battle positions of monsters during their next turn. So that's not really the best card in the world, but it is a card you can potentially use just to lock your opponent's positions. I don't really know. I'm not really sure when that would really come up too much, but maybe there's something where that will. But this card probably should not see play in most situations. But there is potentially a deck where this card could be very good against, and that was the deck I was alluding to earlier with the Unity stuff, and that is this deck that was based around Structure Deck 7, I believe. I believe it was Structure Deck 7. It might have been Structure Deck 8. Might have been Structure Deck 6, actually. I mixed up no, it's not Structure Deck 6. Well, anyways, whatever Structure Deck it was, doesn't really matter to the number. But it's basically a Structure Deck based around flip summoning rock monsters, getting their effects, and then sending them back down. That was a series of cards that was, with Golden Sentry, Guardian Statue, Cryo Sphinx, Hyraka Sphinx, things like that, based around that strategy. And it did get a new inclusion to that, like, not really archetype, but like series of cards in Great Spirit, which is a level 4 rock, 500 attack, 1500 defense, says 1 per turn during your main phase. You can flip this card to face down defense position. When this card flips summoned, you can switch the original attack and defense of one face up earth monster on the field until the end of this turn. So, you could potentially switch the defense of a Golden Sentry to the attack, making 1800 attack, and that's pretty decent. Get in for some damage after bouncing a card to hand. That's kind of neat. They also got this boss monster, Exod Master of the Guard, which is based around Exodia, which is kind of cool. It's like an Exodia retrain, although not really tied to Exodia at all in the lore and stuff, just in the art and the name. I'm not sure why they did that, but either way, kind of a cool card. 0 attack, 4000 defense. Cannot be normal summoned or set. This card cannot be special summoned except by tributing one Sphinx monster. Each time an Earth monster is flip summoned while this card remains face up on the field, inflict 1000 damage to your opponent. So basically it allows you to burn your opponent by flipping up your rock monsters. And that's kind of neat. Do I think the strategy is that good? Not really. It does also have Canyon, which is kind of cool for the strategy too, where it says if a rock type monster in defense position and attack, double any battle damage to the controller of the attacking monster. And one of the ways to stop your opponent from, setting up a loop with like Golden Sentry or stuff like that is you just attack into it to prevent it from actually flip summoning and bouncing back. but Canyon really disincentivizes that because you're taking more damage doing that. So that's kind of neat. Do I think this is that good? Not really, especially given that Breath of Light was also released around this time, which this was just like a promo card. I forget from where exactly, but this is a normal spell that says destroy all face-up rock-type monsters on the field. So this card can just, wipe away all the rocks that this deck plays. But to be fair, they do have to be face-up, and this deck does try and set down a fair bit. So, but it can definitely get rid of Exile at least. So, yeah, this deck is not quite that good. I think the slightly better structure deck is based around Wing Beast. Now, do I think this structure deck is that good? Not really, but it did get some tools in the core set that was introduced, Enemy of Justice, which I will be going into soon. So it probably plays a little bit better than the Exod Master of the Guard deck. The boss monster for this structure deck was Simorgh, Bird of Divinity. It is a level 7 Wing Beast. Effect monster says this card cannot be special summoned. If you tribute summon this card, all tributes must be wind. Each player takes 1,000 damage during each of their end phases while this card remains face up on the field. This damage is decreased by 500 for each spell and trap the player controls. So if you potentially are playing things like Giant Trunade or just ways to bounce back your opponent's spell and traps or destroy your opponent's spell and traps, then this card can be pretty good at dealing damage to them. So that's kind of neat. But it only works during their end phases, so they can just reset those stuff. So it doesn't really even synergize with that. So I don't know. I'm not really sure why that effect is there. It's 2,700 attacker though, so that's kind of neat. And also it's the first Simorgh monster in the game, and people who know the future of the game know that there are some other cooler Simorghs that get introduced later. So it's kind of cool to see the start of that. But unfortunately, this isn't really that good. It also released, in terms of new monsters, Sonic Shooter, which was a level 4 Winged Beast, 1300 attack, 600 defense. Says if there are no cards in your opponent's spell and trap zone, this card can attack your opponent directly. If it does, the battle damage inflicted to your opponent is the original attack of this card. So you can't buff this thing up with a ton of equips and get in that way. You kind of just have to attack in with this thing, deal 1300, and that's, as good as you're going to do. I don't really think this card's that good. I think there are better things that, can deal direct damage in that way, but it is kind of neat. And so it is a Winged Beast, which goes with the theme. But I don't really think it's that good. Next up, we've got the new support for Harpies, which was also a big sort of sub-theme of that structure deck, which is Hysteric Party. This is a continuous trap that says activate this card by discarding one card. Special summon as many copies of Harpy Lady as possible from your graveyard. When this face-up card leaves the field, destroy those monsters. So that's kind of neat. You get out a bunch of Harpy Lady 1s potentially, which are counted as Harpy Lady, and they buff each other up, so that's kind of cool. And it's kind of like a turbo Call of the Haunted, which is kind of neat as well. You can also play it 3 copies too. But it does require you to discard a card, and frankly, the Harpies are not really as good as some of the things that you can get back off Call of the Haunted. So realistically, I don't think this card's that good, but it's kind of neat to see here. And lastly, for the cards that actually do stuff in these new promos, because there were a fair amount of cards that are just sort of here to be here, like normal cards, or just ritual monsters like Dharma Sword that don't really add anything new to the game, really. But the last of the cards that actually has a unique effect at this time is Hidden Soldiers. It's a normal trap that says when your opponent normal summons or flip summons a monster, special summon one level 4 or lower dark monster from your hand. So, this is a way to sort of get a monster out on the field quickly, which is kind of neat. But it does require your opponent to do something on their turn, so they can just respond to that. So it's not really the best thing in the world. I think cards like A Hero Emerges are slightly better than this card, but it does do something unique, so I figured I'd mention it here. And that's going to do it for the new promos. Now that we've gone through these, let's dive into the core set itself, which was Enemy of Justice, which did add some very, very impactful cards to the game. Enemy of Justice was a very interesting set. It came after a couple of sets that really did not shake up the metagame at all that much. And to be fair, Enemy of Justice doesn't really add things that super shake up the metagame, but it does add some very impactful cards that have a pretty long shadow over the course of Yu-Gi-Oh's history. And the cards that I'm referring to here are Dimensional Fissure and Macrocosmos. This sort of introduces a new type of Floodgate, and one that can be very devastating for a variety of decks, and that can also be the basis for their own deck, which is very, very cool. So Dimensional Fissure is a continuous spell that says any monster sent to the graveyard is banished instead, which is, disastrous for certain decks like Monarchs, which need their Treeborn Frog in grave, and just any deck that is graveyard based, for instance, like Chaos, right? They want to get their monsters in grave, and Dimensional Fissure complicates that quite a bit. Macrocosmos is similar to Dimensional Fissure, except it's a continuous trap. It says when this card is activated, you can spell summon one Helios the Primordial Sun from your hand or deck. That doesn't really come up that often because most of the time these decks are not playing Helios the Primordial Sun. That's just a monster that gains 100 attack and defense for each monster banished, which frankly is not quite that good in this format. But it can come up for, certain things that require an effect that like special summon something. For instance, when Solemn Warning comes out later, Macrocosmos can actually be Solemn Warninged because, it does special summon technically. But that's for a, much future video on the channel. But the important part about this card is that while this card is face up on the field, any card sent to the graveyard is banished instead. So these two cards on the field basically prevent cards from being sent to the graveyard. And that can be very good for certain decks and very bad for other decks, which allows you to make a variety of decks with this card. And the first deck that we feature on the channel will probably be focused around these cards in a strategy called Macro Monarch. So we'll be playing that, I think, as the first Chaos Return video on the channel. But, I think this is a very, very neat strategy, and just having more cards that banish in general is kind of an unexplored design philosophy at this point in the game. So I'm glad to see that they're sort of leaning into that a bit more. Of course, with Macrocosmos, it does have its own specific card here, Grand Convergence. So the quick play spell says if you control Macrocosmos, inflict 300 damage to your opponent and destroy all monsters on the field. So it's basically like Dark Hole. But, it also deals burn. So that's kind of neat. So if you are playing a macro deck, you could potentially play Grand Convergence. And that's, like, honestly a pretty cool and powerful blowout card there. For monsters that banish, we also have Banisher of the Radiance. They level 3 light fairy monster, 16 attack, 0 defense. That any card sent to the graveyard is banished instead. So we have a monster, a spell, and a trap that all do this banishing thing. So that's kind of neat. And also, this is clearly a takeoff of Banisher of the Light, which was released all the way back in Magic Ruler, which has a similar effect to this. But very, very cool card. And does allow fairies to get a bit aggressive, as it is 1600, which is a decent stat line for just beating over things. Now, this is a fairy, partially because fairies do have a bunch of cards that synergize with this sort of banishing effect, namely Miraculous Descent. Miraculous Descent is a continuous trap that says target one of your banished fairy monsters, special summon it. When this card leaves the field, destroy that monster. When that monster is destroyed, destroy this card. So if you have fairies banished, you can bring this thing back with Miraculous Descent, kind of like Call the Haunted Four Fairies in this way, except it brings back from banished, which not many cards do in this format. So that's very, very cool. Now you might be wondering, how do I get a fairy banish if I don't have Banisher of the Radiance or one of these floodgates up? Well, luckily, there's Elemental Absorber. This card's not very good. I wouldn't recommend it to banish fairies, but it is a card that can banish fairies from your hand. And we will get into some fairies that will probably be in your hand later on in the sort of breakdown of the cards here. But Elemental Absorber is a continuous trap that says remove from play one monster card in your hand. You know it's bad when it has not received problem-solving card text to include banish. You activate the card by doing that, and then your opponent's monsters that have the same attribute as the monster removed by this effect cannot declare an attack. So, if you want to stop your opponent's light monster from attacking, you use this thing. If you have other attributes as well, you potentially banish those as well. And, this set did release some attributable support for different strategies, I guess, namely updating a series of monsters that have been releasing throughout the GX era, namely the Charmers. We've got Avalanching Asa, Blazing Hita, Raging Uriah, and Storming Wind here for wind, water, fire, and earth. Now, these things are not really that good. They have, I think, very similar stat lines to the original Charmers. I think the original Charmers had 400 attack, 1500 defense. These have 800 attack, 1500 defense. But these are not flip monsters. They say once per turn, you can tribute one of their given attribute and special summon one of that given attribute from your hand. But the monster special summoned by this effect is destroyed if the monster that summoned it, namely Avalanching Asa, Blazing Hita, Raging Uriah, or Storming Wind, is removed from your side of the field. So not really that good because you're putting a lot of investment into bringing out a monster from your hand. So realistically, the only time that would come up is if like you have a 2 tribute monster in your hand, and you have one monster on field, you summon out one of these, tribute that monster, bring out the 2 tribute monster from hand. But a lot of decks don't really play those 2 tribute monsters, and if you are playing deck with 1 tribute monster, you can just normal summon that monster by tributing a card in your field. So I don't think these cards are that good. There are certain decks that maybe just like specifically want things like this, but I can't really think of them off the top of my head, and I don't think that they're really that competitively viable. But anyways, that was sort of a tangent because of Elemental Absorber. Let's go back to the fairies here with that sort of banishing support, because a lot of fairies do interact with this. And Laird the Liberator is sort of the other one that interacts with this banishing idea. Laird the Liberator is a level 4 light fairy, 1400 attack, 1500 defense. Each time a counter trap is activated, immediately after it resolves, add 2 of your banished fairy monsters to your hand. So you can add back those fairies, which is kind of cool. And it also goes with another theme of fairies here, which is counter fairies. Enemy of Justice just tries to do a ton of things with fairies, like in just completely different directions. But it's kind of neat to see Laird the Liberator, like, sort of uniting those two sides of the fairy strategy here together. So the iconic card from this set that sort of goes with this strategy is Bountiful Artemis. There's a level 4 light fairy, 1600 attack, 700 defense. Each time a counter trap is activated, immediately after it resolves, draw one card. That's a really good effect. And honestly, I will probably be trying to build counter fairies because I do think that with Bountiful Artemis and also some of the other cards introduced here, you can potentially build a pretty good deck with it. And if you're using the counter traps to potentially protect your floodgates like Dimensional Fissure or Macrocosmos, then you can both stymie your opponent's strategy and also protect your stuff, draw cards, and that's pretty cool to me. But speaking of counter traps, there was a new counter trap added in this set that counter fairies probably wants to play, and that's Force Back. The counter trap that says negate the normal or flip summon a monster and return it to the owner's hand. So it's really bad for your opponent's tempo, and also it can stop things like Monarchs from using their effects, and even flip monsters from using their effect as well. It gets you a draw as well if you've got Bountiful Artemis on field. Gets you more resources if you got Laird the Liberator on field as well. So I think this card is definitely going to see play in the counter fairy deck. And of course, if you actually successfully resolve a counter trap, you've also got Voltanis the Adjudicator. This says after one of your counter traps has been resolved, you contribute all monsters you control to special summon this card. If this card is special summoned this way, you can destroy cards on your opponent's or your opponent controls, that is, up to the number of fairy type monsters you attributed. So that's pretty good, as if you use a counter trap to stop an opponent's play, then bring this thing out and pop the rest of their board too, then that seems like a big swing. This thing has 2800 attack, which is a pretty hefty attack stat too. So that's kind of cool. However, I'm not sure you necessarily want to be tributing things like Laird or Bountiful Artemis, which gets you a lot of value there. But it is still kind of cool to just have this boss monster that you can go for here. And if you do bring it out off something like Miraculous Descent or something, that could potentially be a better way to get this boss into the picture. Although if you're bringing out a fairy boss monster, you might want to consider something like Majestic Mech Goryu. This is a part of a series of cards known as the Majestic Mechs here that were introduced in this set. And, they're all basically cards balanced around being able to cheat them out early, but then they destroy themselves at the end of the turn. So this one, it's a 2 tribute fairy with 2900 attack, 1800 defense. It says you can tribute this card, but not set this card, but for 1 tribute. If summoned this way, during the end phase, send it to the graveyard. If this card attacks defense position monster, inflict piercing battle damage to your opponent. So that's a pretty good effect. If there's walling up behind things, you can bring this out. Get in for piercing damage. Then if it potentially gets banished after being destroyed, you can bring it back to Miraculous Descent or with Laird the Liberator. So that's kind of cool. Although you might want to pair that combo with the Majestic Mech Oko, which is the level 6 fairy, 2400 attack, 1400 defense. Says you can normal summon this card without tributing. If you do during the end phase, send it to the graveyard. So the idea behind this is that you bring this thing out just as a normal summon, attack in, wipe away an opponent's powerful thing. It gets destroyed, banished if you've got Macro or Dimensional Fissure, or banished for the Radiance up. And then if you activate a counter trap, you can bring it back with Laird to hand and then summon it out again on a later turn. So that's kind of neat that you've got that sort of loop going here. And I think that was partially intentional with the mechs, although it probably would have been better if they just stuck around on field. But either way, if these 2 cards are banished, you can bring it back with Descent, which is pretty good. You can also potentially do stuff with Senku. This is a level 4 Majestic Mech, which is kind of counterintuitive, and there's a reason why no one really plays this, because it's kind of bad here. It says, when this card inflicts battle damage to your opponent by direct attack, draw 1 card. During the end phase of this turn, this card was summoned, sent into the graveyard. So the idea is that, it does get destroyed, but it has such a powerful effect that it makes sense that it gets destroyed. But realistically, if you want to play something else that does this effect, Mass Sorcerer is probably a bit better for you, because that's just a 900 attack point monster that draws you a card but inflicts battle damage. So you don't really even need to play Majestic Mech Senku. But if you do want to pair it with Miraculous Descent or something, I guess you can do that. But the fact that it's destroyed at the end of the turn summoned, so it doesn't matter if it's normal, special, etc., really does hold this card back. So I don't really think this card is that good. Of course, if you want to cheat these cards out through other means, you also have Celestial Transformation. There's a quick play spell. It says special summon 1 fairy monster from your hand. That monster's attack is halved. Also is destroyed during the end phase. So sort of going with the theme of these Majestic Mechs here, where, you could bring back a powerful monster, but then it's destroyed at the end of the turn. So that's kind of neat. But I think it kind of just I don't know. It just feels kind of underwhelming, these Majestic Mechs, honestly. Even if you are going through the process of bringing these back with Descent or something like that, it just feels kind of awkward to actually go through all that. But, I don't know. There are decks that could potentially loop it and be a powerful control deck with these guys as big bosses at the end. Of course, before finishing my discussion of fairies, I have to discuss some of the cards that sort of conflict with the banishing sort of aspect of it. Namely, Herald of Green Light and Herald of Purple Light. These are both fairies that when your opponent activates a trap or a spell card respectively, you can send this card and one other fairy monster from your hand to the graveyard, negate the activation if you do destroy it. Now, because that's a cost, and because it specifically specifies graveyard, you can't actually activate these effects if you've got Dimensional Fissure, Macrocosmos, or Banisher of the Radiance up. So that's sort of like an anti-synergy with the deck. They do negating, which is part of what the deck wants to do. But in the form of the deck that exists in Enemy of Justice, it doesn't really go with that. So that's kind of awkward. And I don't know, maybe they weren't really thinking of the consequences of this, or maybe they felt like, you know, this would be too powerful if they could be used with Dimensional Fissure or Macrocosmos up. But it just sort of makes like this conflict with the rest of the deck, or what the rest of the deck is trying to do. Of course, the last fairy that I want to talk about here also kind of conflicts with that, and that's Royal Knight. It's a level 3 light fairy monster, 1300 attack, 1800 defense. It said, when this card destroys a monster by battle and sends it to the graveyard, gain life points equal to the defense of the destroyed monster. So, I mean, there's so much going on with this card. One, it has to send it to the graveyard, which conflicts with the macro and banisher stuff. Two, it's only got 1300 attack, so like it's not really going to be destroying too many cards. And three, all it does is gain you life points, and that's like fine, especially if you got like Cestus of Dagla, which is another fairy equipped card that sort of you can pair with this, I guess. But like realistically, this card's not very good. I don't think that any fairy deck, no matter what version you play, should play this card. But it is kind of neat to see another fairy here, potentially less good than a lot of the other fairies in this set. But of course, fairies weren't the only type to get a glow up here. Machines also got a bit of new support. And by a bit, I mainly just mean Cyber Phoenix. Cyber Phoenix is a level 4 fire machine monster. 1200 attack, 1600 defense. Says, while this card is in attack position, negate any spell or trap effects that target one machine monster you control and no other cards. When this card is destroyed by battle and sent to the graveyard, you can draw one card. That is really good. That is like, I mean, it's not like game-breakingly good, right? But it is enough to make a machine deck based around Cyber Phoenix and other good machines that have existed in the format a lot more viable here, because it negates things like Sakurai 2 Armor, it negates things like Snatch Steal. There are a lot of good things that this negates. Also the fact that its firing can be brought out off of UFO Turtle, which is also a machine. Really, really good. And also the fact that like this thing is very vulnerable to battle because it only has 1200 attack. But if it is destroyed by battle, you get to draw a card. This card is just like really, really good. I love the design of this card. I think it's super good. And I'm excited to be playing decks that actually play this card, because I do think it is a great piece of support, great example of how to do retro support for a strategy like machines. That being said, this is really the only good machine added to the format in this set. I mean, you do have some others, like Victory Viper XX03 could see potential play specifically in this format, because if this card destroys an opponent's monster by battle, note does not specify that it needs to be sent to the graveyard. It says activate one of the effects. This card gains 400 attack permanently. This card can target one face-up spell or trap card on the field, destroy that target, or it can special summon one option token where its type, attribute, level, and attack and defense are always the same with this card, but destroy it if this card is no longer face-up on the field. So I do, in fact, like this card in the context of this set, because it can stop things like Macrocosmos or Dimensional Fissure, so that's kind of neat. Also, the permanent attack buff is nice if you don't actually, you know, have to worry about Macro or Dimensional Fissure. It also has this additional like option token thing, which can come up if you've gotten it to use its attack buff thing. So that's kind of neat. And I think this card's just neat overall. Like, I don't think it's necessarily the best in the world, but in the context of this set, it's really cool. And it does have a spell associated with it. Power Capsule. This is a normal spell that says select one face of Victory Viper XX03 you control to activate this card. Select one effect of Victory Viper XX03 and apply it as this card's effect. So that's pretty cool as well. This can basically be like a convoluted version of MST to pop like Dimensional Fissure or Macrocosmos. Or you could potentially, I mean, can you actually use the 400 attack thing if you activate Power Capsule? I feel like you can. Because I feel like I mean, that would be weird. That'd be weird if you couldn't. Especially because the option token thing doesn't really make sense. If I think the way this works is that it selects a Victory Viper XX03 on field and then applies the effect of that card as this card effect. So like, it's very convoluted, but I do think this all works. You know, I think it does work if this card's on the field. It's not just an MST for face-up spells and traps, right? That'd be kind of wild if it was. I don't know. I'm not sure if rulings have been laid out about this card, but it's kind of weird if it would not be able to work that way. But, you know, Yu-Gi-Oh! Is a game made up of weird cards, so maybe that is how it goes. For the other machines here, they get a lot worse. Cyber Kieran is a level 3 light machine, 300 attack, 800 defense, says, you contribute this card to make any effect damage you take this turn 0. I don't know if that's a quick effect. It might not be a quick effect, honestly. But either way, I mean, that's not really the best. Like, if your opponent is going to deal burn damage to you and they see this on field, they'll just remove it before they do the burn damage. So, like, I don't really think that's good. So, yeah, I don't know. I don't like this card at all. But it's kind of neat that they're trying to experiment with different cyber monsters. Just this card is not one of them. Not one of the good ones, at least. We get Searchlight Man for the last machine introduced in this set. This is a flip effect monster, 1000 attack, 1000 defense, says flip. Your opponent cannot set or flip face down any cards for the rest of this turn. I don't know. I guess if your opponent waits to set their cards in main phase 2, like they're waiting to set their back row main phase 2 because they're like, well, okay, I can give my opponent the least amount of information possible by doing this, then this can punish that because now they can't set those cards in main phase 2. But, like, I don't know. This card just feels so bad. It's a very, very underwhelming effect. And realistically, you're only going to be using it when your opponent destroys it by battle. Or I guess flips it face up with like Swords of Healing Light. That could potentially happen, but that won't happen enough to actually justify this card's inclusion in any deck. Really, really cool artwork, though. I love the artwork on this card. It just unfortunately has a terrible effect, terrible stats, so probably shouldn't see play in any sort of deck here. Now, that may be the last machine monster in this set, but the Batteryman also got new supports, and Batteryman C does support machines, so I figured it's appropriate to talk about it here. Batteryman D is a level 1 light thunder monster, 0 attack, 19 defense. Says your opponent cannot select a thunder type monster you control as an attack target except Batteryman D. So this can protect your other Batterymen. If you've got a C up buffing your machines, then you potentially use this to protect the C. Or if you've got double A's that you're trying to set up, get multiple of those to boost their attack to high heights, then you potentially have this to protect those. I don't really think this is that good overall, but it is something, and that's kind of neat. And Batteryman finally got a card that sort of synergized with all the Batterymen, which is Super Electromagnetic Voltec Dragon. There's a level 5 Thunder, 2400 attack, 1000 defense, Monarch stat line there. And it says if you tribute summon this card by tributing one of the following monsters, this card gains the appropriate effect. Batteryman D, negate the effect of a spell or trap card that targets this one card. Batteryman C, during battle between this attacking card and a defense monster whose defense is lower than the attack of this card, inflict the difference of battle damage to your opponent, so just piercing battle damage there. And lastly, Batteryman AA, this card gains 1000 attack. So it could be a 3400 beater, could be a beater with piercer like Dark Triceratops, or it could be a monster that prevents spell or trap from targeting it. That's kind of neat. Is it worth playing a Batteryman package? Not really. But it's kind of cool to see them giving a boss monster to this sort of series of cards that they've like released at like a drip feed. So I kind of find it interesting to see this Batteryman archetype just continuing to grow. And of course, in the future, it will grow even further. But that will be quite some time in the future. Now, the next card that sort of has potential meta relevance in this format is Destiny Hero Diamond Dude. Now, people who are familiar with this time period of Yu-Gi-Oh's history will remember this card. This was the basis of Diamond Dude Turbo, which was a very popular card around the time. I'm not sure if it can necessarily be built in this format specifically, but it definitely will be something to keep an eye on going forward here. But Destiny Hero Diamond Dude is a very, very unique monster. Level 4 warrior, 1400 attack, 1600 defense. Says once per turn, you can activate the top card of your deck, and if it is a normal spell, send it to the graveyard. Otherwise, place it on the bottom of your deck. During the main phase of your next turn, you can activate the effect of that spell in your graveyard, even if you no longer control this card. Now, the interesting thing about that is that you can activate the effect of that spell in your graveyard. It doesn't mean that you have to pay the cost. So you can actually use this thing with a bunch of spells that have effects that are very good, but costs that are hard to pay. And you can use this to mill those and get those effect off. Things like Death's Croaking or just other very powerful cards like that. And of course, this would see a lot more success later on when you get Duelist Pass Aster coming out. But for now, there are some things that you can still do with it. So I think it's still fun to play. Now, to give you an example of what I mean by that, there is one spell in this set that actually does satisfy that sort of thing that would mean that you might want to play in Diamond Dude Turbo. I wouldn't recommend it because its effect is kind of underwhelming, but that is Hero Flash. Hero Flash is a normal spell that says banish 1 H-Heated Heart, E Emergency Call, all Righteous Justice, and O Oversoul from your graveyard. Spell summon 1 Elemental Hero normal monster from your deck. All Elemental Hero normal monster you control can attack your opponent directly this turn. So I don't really think that's a good effect at this point in the game because the highest attack on an Elemental Hero normal monster is 1600. So, like, this isn't really that good. But, you could potentially mill it with Diamond Dude and not have to banish those other associated cards and just immediately get out a card from deck and do things with that. Now, you might be wondering, what are the cards mentioned by this card? Well, I'm glad you asked, because those sort of form a new sort of set of support for the Elemental Heroes. We do get Destiny Heroes in this set, as Diamond Dude illustrates, but the Elemental Heroes are not forgotten about. H-Heated Heart is a normal spell that says target one face-up monster you control until the end of this turn. It gains 500 attack, and if it attacks a defensive monster, inflict piercing battle damage to your opponent. So that's kind of neat. Gives your monster a buff and does things like that. And also, if you pair it with the Hero Flash and just give it 500 attack, then you're potentially buffing it up to deal more damage to your opponent directly. Emergency Call is easily the best of these spells, in my opinion. It says add one elemental hero monster from your deck to your hand. Great searcher and an archetype that is trying to fuse with specific elemental heroes. It's very, very nice to be able to just search one directly to hand that you need. Our Righteous Justice is a normal spell. It says destroy spell and trap cards on the field equal to the number of elemental heroes you control. And note that says exactly equal. It's not less than or, just up to. It's just equal. So if you have 2 elemental heroes and your opponent has 1 spell or trap card, you cannot activate this card. Or I guess you can destroy itself and the card. So I guess you can still do stuff there, but it just can lead to very convoluted situations. So just keep in mind that you have to do exactly the number on RH just if you do want to use this. Next up, we got Oversoul, the normal spell that says target one elemental hero normal monster in your graveyard, spell summon that target. So, again, you can use this to get out a normal monster and do things with it, potentially with Hero Flash as well, because, if you activate Oversoul to get your last one of the hero cards in the graveyard, and then you activate Hero Flash, bring out another normal monster from your deck, then both of those will be able to attack directly. So that's kind of neat. And the last piece of elemental hero support in terms of spells or traps is Elemental Recharge. The normal trap that says gain 1,000 life points for each face-up elemental hero monster you control. I mean, that can be a nice little boost, but effects to gain you life points is not really relevant in this format, hadn't been for quite some time. So not the best card in the world, but it's something that is interesting to know about. Now, of course, that does it for the spells and traps that elemental heroes got, but they actually did receive a number of fusion monsters that I want to talk about. The first two, which, relate to the cover card of the set, are just sort of like, alternate variations of previous hero fusions that we've seen that are much worse. They were used by Astro Phoenix in the anime, but realistically, it's just better to use like Flame Wingman and Shining Flare Wingman. But they are Elemental Hero Phoenix Enforcer and Elemental Hero Shining Phoenix Enforcer. Now, Elemental Hero Phoenix Enforcer is made up of Elemental Hero Avian and Elemental Hero Bersintrix, which make up Elemental Hero Flame Wingman. And it has basically the same stats, I believe, 2,100 attack and 1,200 defense. And it says, it must be fusion summoned, cannot be spell summoned in other ways, and this card cannot be destroyed by battle. So, I guess if you want a 2,100 attack point monster that doesn't get destroyed by battle, that's kind of nice, but most of the time people are dealing with fusions by effects anyways, so this card isn't really the best, but it can crash with a Cyber Dragon, so that's kind of nice, but realistically, that won't come up too often. Shining Phoenix Enforcer is very, very similar. It's made of Elemental Hero Phoenix Enforcer and Elemental Hero Sparkman, must be fusion summoned and cannot be spell summoned by other ways. This card gains 300 attack for each Elemental Hero card in your graveyard. This card cannot be destroyed by battle, so that's kind of an awkward effect to have on a monster that's supposed to be like really high attack, because this thing is probably going above 3,000 attack, and most cards in the game at this point don't really get above that threshold. So this card doesn't really need to be destroyed by battle. But I guess it's an effect that can maybe come up in really weird edge cases. But I don't really think this card is worth playing over like Shining Flare Wingman. And I sort of have the same philosophy with Elemental Hero Phoenix Enforcer versus Flame Wingman. But that being said, this format does have an unlimited fusion deck, so you can potentially just play them in that fusion deck just to have access in like weird edge cases. Maybe comes up. But either way, I don't think these cards are that worth talking about much further. Now, the Elemental Heroes also got some other fusions that actually do unique things, and they're made up of unique combinations that we haven't seen yet. So Elemental Hero Mariner, level 5 Warrior Fusion, 14 attack, 1,000 defense, made up of Elemental Hero Bubbleman and Elemental Hero Avian, must be fusion summoned and cannot be spell summoned by other ways. While you have any face down cards in your spell trap zones, this card can attack your opponent directly. So that's kind of neat. Attacks him for 1,400. Not really that good at this point. It will see play later on in the game's history for other reasons that are not really related to that, but it is good to know about potentially. We've got Elemental Hero Necroid Shaman as well, level 6 Warrior Fusion, 1900 attack, 1800 defense, made with Elemental Hero Wildheart and Elemental Hero Necroshade, must be fusion summoned and cannot be spell summoned by other ways. When this card is spell summoned, target one monster your opponent controls, destroy that target, then spell summon one monster from your opponent's graveyard to their side of the field. That's kind of neat, honestly. Pops one of their stuff. It does bring back a monster from their graveyard, but you get to pick the monster that gets brought back, so you could potentially pick up like a weak monster that doesn't really do much. So I think this card's kind of cool. I don't think it's the best thing in the world, but it is kind of neat. So I figured I'd talk about it here. Next up, we get Elemental Hero Wild Wingman. Really going all in on the Wild Heart fusions here. This is a Warrior Fusion, 19 attack, 23 on defense, made with Wild Heart and Avion. Much fusion summon cannot be special summoned by other ways. You can discard one card to target one's face up, or not face up, just one spell trap card on the field, destroy that target. So that's kind of neat. It, just pops your opponent's back row, and it's not once per turn, so you can just do that over and over again. So that's kind of cool. But realistically, I don't think that this card or Necroid Shaman or Mariner are really that good. I don't think they catapult heroes into like tier 1 or anything like that. It's just another tool for the archetype, which is always cool to see. So I will be showing off a bit of a hero build for this format in the future. But anyways, we've been talking about elemental heroes, but we got to get back to the new kids on the block, the Destiny heroes. And what better way to transition there than D-Time, which is a normal trap that says when a face-up elemental hero monster you control leaves the field, add one Destiny hero monster from your deck to your hand, whose level is less than or equal to that elemental hero monster's original level. So this shows that you can play elemental heroes and Destiny heroes in the same deck. At this point in time, I don't really think there's much merit to doing that, besides potentially doing like Destiny heroes sending Hero Flash, which I don't really think is that good anyways. But it is kind of neat to see them trying to tie these hero stuff together, basically from the beginning. Now, of course, this is mainly here because in the anime, Ash Phoenix started out playing like elemental heroes to sort of mess with Jaden, and then this transitioned into his actual strategy, which is Destiny heroes. So that's kind of cool. But I do think it's neat, regardless of the reason for this card existing, I think it's neat that this card exists. But getting into the other Destiny heroes, they're not really that good, honestly. Like, Diamond Dude is definitely the best one. You got Doom Lord first, the level 3 warrior, 600 attack, 800 defense. Says once per turn, you can target one monster your opponent controls, banish that target. Do not declare an attack. The turn you activate this effect, you must control this face-up attack which monster to activate, and to resolve this effect, the banished monster returns to your opponent's field during your second standby phase after this effect is activated. So, this card is kind of a very, very slow way to remove an opponent's threat, and not really a very good one. Now, this card can potentially come up in like certain situations, and it will come up in later formats as a tech card that people will play, but I don't really think it's good here. Next, we got Destiny Hero Captain Tenacious, the level 3 warrior. It says once per turn during your standby phase, you can target one Destiny Hero monster in your graveyard that was destroyed in battle since your last standby phase. If you control this face-up card when that target was destroyed, special summon that target. That may seem pretty good at first until you realize the thing has 800 attack and 800 defense. So if your opponent is attacking a monster while this thing is face up on the field, they're probably attacking this guy. Now, of course, there are ways to get around this. For instance, like, if you've got an effect that basically funnels your opponent's attacks into the other Destiny hero, then you can potentially get your opponent to do that. But like, realistically, it's not really that good because there aren't really too many effects that do that well. So I don't know. I don't think this card is very good. For the last Destiny hero monster, before we talk about that, we got to talk about Clock Tower Prison. There's a field spell that says once per turn during your opponent's standby phase, place one clock counter on this card. While there are 4 or more clock counters on this card, you do not take any battle damage. If this card with 4 or more clock counters is destroyed and sent to the graveyard, spell summon one Destiny hero Dreadmaster from your hand or deck. And Destiny hero Dreadmaster is this guy. Before we talk about him, I just want to mention Clock Tower Prison, a very classic card in like sealed environments, because this card can be really annoying to deal with in those environments, because basically once it gets 4 more clock counters on it, it can basically block all the damage coming in. It can clock block that damage, and that can be very, very good to just like slow down the pace of play and prevent you from dying. So this can just be a very annoying card for your opponent to deal with if you are playing one of those stall decks. But now that we've covered that, let's talk about Destiny Hero Dreadmaster, the man himself, the boss monster of the archetype, or the boss monster because he's not really that good at this point. This card is a warrior with 8 stars. Question mark attack, question mark defense. Says if this card is spell summoned by Clock Tower Prison, destroy all monsters you control except Destiny Hero monsters. Also, after that, you can spell summon up to 2 Destiny Hero monsters from your graveyard. After this card is spell summoned for the rest of this turn, Destiny Hero monsters you control cannot be destroyed by battle. Also, you take no battle damage when they battle. The attack and defense of this card are equal to the combined original attack of all other Destiny Hero monsters you control. Now, as a note there, it does not actually say that it needs to be spell summoned, so you could potentially normal summon this card. So you could just tribute 2 cards, bring out this thing, and then it will still like gain the attack of all Destiny Hero monsters you control. But like, if you look at the attack stats on these Destiny Hero monsters, there aren't really many good ones. So even if you have a bunch of Destiny Heroes out on field, this thing probably won't have the most attack. And it is a 2 tribute, and for 2 tributes, you need to be doing something really, really good. Unfortunately, this doesn't quite do it. And if you do bring it out with Clock Tower Prison, it doesn't even do that much. It does bring back your Destiny Heroes from grave, which is kind of neat to buff up its attack more. But like, I don't know, it still don't really do that much, especially given that all these Destiny Hero monsters are pretty weak. So I don't really think it's that good. Also, Clock Tower Prison can easily be removed if your opponent does have access to spell and trap removal before it gets the clock counters on it. And waiting basically 4 turns for a boss monster to be brought out that isn't really that good, already, it is not really a good strategy in general. So I don't think this card's that good right now, but it is a very, very cool card for sure. Next up, we got D-Signal, or Destiny Signal, that is. It says, when a monster you control is destroyed by battle and sent to the graveyard, special summon one level 4 or lower Destiny Hero monster from your hand or deck. So pretty much like Hero Signal, except, again, Destiny Heroes are not really that good. And, I mean, I'm not saying the Elemental Heroes are good in general, but there are at least some good ones. I guess there's one good one in Diamond Dude, but, like, it's just not really worth playing Destiny Signal to turbo out this guy, in my opinion. But next up, we got D-Shield. D-Shield is a normal trap that says, when in attack position, Destiny Hero monster you control is targeted for an attack, target it, change it to defense position, and equip it with this card. The equipped monster cannot be destroyed by battle. So that's kind of neat. It can protect things like a Destiny Hero Diamond Dude or a Captain Tenacious that can then bring back your cards as long as it's still on field. That's kind of neat. I'm not sure whether you want to invest a D-Shield into that Tenacious, but you could potentially do that and then just keep bringing back things that are destroyed. So that's kind of cool. But I think that's probably the best of the Destiny Hero support cards, but even then, it's not really that good because, again, you're kind of got a weak core of monsters to go with here. But if you pair this card with something like Guard Penalty, at least it can draw you a card as well. This is a quick play spell that says, select one monster on the field. If it's changed to defense position this turn, draw one card. Listen, I'm trying to reach to actually connect this to something that I've talked about here. It's not a really good card at all, but it is something you can play, and it's kind of neat. So, I mean, it was mainly just played in the anime with like Spark Blaster and changing things back and forth. But realistically, Spark Blaster is a pretty bad card, and you'd have to draw that and this and Spark Man to actually pull that off. And if you're pulling all that off to draw more cards, you could have just not played them at all and drawn better cards to begin with. So I don't think this is that worth playing a deck around. But moving on to the next sort of like meta relevant card that's introduced. It might not be meta relevant now, but it is very, very good to keep in mind. And that's Icarus Attack. It's a normal trap that says tribute one winged beast monster, then target 2 cards on the field, destroy them. So this card will see a ton of play in later formats when winged beasts get a lot better. But in this format, it's not really the best thing in the world. It does help out with the Harpies support that I mentioned in the structure deck in the sort of miscellaneous section of the video. But I don't think that too many cards will be able to take full advantage of this, but I'm curious to see what people will come up with this card because I'm sure that people will brew up decks to try and break this card in this format. Now, there are some other things that you can pair with this card. Things like Swiftbird Banjo, that's a winged beast, 6-star monster, 2300 attack, 1400 defense. If you tribute summon this card by tributing a wind monster, return all spell and trap cards on the field to the owner's hand. So that's sort of like a giant True Nade effect. That's kind of neat. Unfortunately, it sends back your Icarus Attack if you were planning on using that at some point, but you can chain Icarus Attack to this effect, I guess, and tribute it off. But that's a lot of investment, so I'm not really sure it's worth doing. But it's kind of neat to see sort of a wind boss monster that's not 7 stars like Simorg was. For other wind cards, we've also got Whirlwind Weasel. There's a flip card. It says your opponent cannot activate any spell or trap cards for the rest of this turn. So what you can do is you can flip up Whirlwind Weasel and prevent them from activating more spells and traps. And then you can bring out Swiftbird Banjo, so that way you get rid of their chainable stuff. Although they can always just chain it to Whirlwind Weasel being flipped up. So not really the best, but it is something, I guess. It's something. But I don't know. Wind is just struggling at this point. Luckily, Harpies did get another piece of support in this set that actually is pretty decent. I like this card a lot. Harpies Pet Baby Dragon, level 4 Wind, Dragon. It says it gains effect based on the number of Harpy monsters you control, except Harpies Pet Dragon, or Harpies Pet Baby Dragon, that is. You have just 1. It says your opponent cannot target Harpy monsters you control for attacks except Harpy's Pet Baby Dragon. For 2, you double the original attack and defense of this card from 1200 600 to 2400 and 1200. And with 3, once per turn, you can target 1 card your opponent controls, destroy that target. I think this is a really, really neat card. It can basically be a better boss monster for Harpies. And like if you manage to pull off a bunch of monsters on your side of the field, it can be very, very threatening. So I love this card. I think it's super cool. I might be trying to break it in this format. I don't know if there's a good way to do that, but either way, it could be fun to try. Moving on from one anime female protagonist deck to another, or maybe not protagonist, but like main character, we've also got some cards that Alexis played in the GX series. Cyber Gymnast, Cyber Tutu, and Cyber Prima. She sort of had like a weird like cyber monster stuff going on, but they didn't really synergize that well together. So these cards don't really synergize with each other either, but they are kind of neat to talk about. Cyber Gymnast is a level 4 warrior, 800 attack, 1800 defense. 1 per turn, you can discard 1 card, then target 1 attack position monster your opponent controls, destroy that target. So that's kind of neat. 1800 defense can wall up against things, so you can just sort of keep using it as removal, but it will cost you cards eventually, and I think Warriors just has other ways to deal with their opponent's threats rather than Cyber Gymnast, so they don't really need this card. Cyber Tutu, level 3 warrior, Earth, 1000 attack, 800 defense. Says if the attack of each monster your opponent controls is higher than the attack of this card can attack your opponent directly. Kind of a neat sort of direct attack effect. You know, we've seen a bunch of those. We saw the card from the Wind Structure deck that did a similar thing if your opponent had no back row. Now we see one with just based on attacks. So that's kind of neat. I don't really think this card's that good because if you want to buff this thing up to get in for more damage, then it won't be able to attack directly. So it's kind of like counterintuitive there. At least there is some wiggle room for that. If you buff up your opponent's attacks and then buff up this as well, then you potentially get in for more, but I'm not really sure if it's worth doing that to get in for damage with this. But still a very, very neat card here. And lastly, for these new Cyber monsters, we've got Cyber Prima, the level 6 Light Warrior, attack 2300, defense 1600. So if this card is tribute summoned, destroy all face-up spells on the field. So that's kind of a neat out to Dimensional Fissure, although it does not destroy Macrocosmos. So I don't really know if this card's worth playing, but it is kind of neat. Level 6, you know, warrior boss monster, I guess, if you want to go for that. But realistically, I don't think that is that good. Moving on to the last card that is potentially relevant for decks in this format, like if they want to see competitive play, we've got Life Equalizer. Now, I don't really think this card's that competitive, so I'm putting it at the very, very end of this list here. But this card can see play in Magical Explosion FTK. The normal trap that says activate only when the difference between both players' life points is 8,000 or more. Both players' life points become 3,000. So what you can do is you can drop your opponent's, or drop not your opponent's life points, but your own life points down pretty low over the course of doing like Library FTK stuff. And also buff your opponent's life points with Upstart Goblins. And then you can reduce the life points down to 3,000 each. And then you can activate Magical Explosion to kill them without having to go through much of your deck. I don't really think it's that good at this point in the game. Most FDK decks are not really that good at this point in the game. And also, you know, with Macrocosmos existing as well, you know, that just makes Magical Explosion FTK even worse. But this card did see some play historically for that sort of purpose, so I figured I'd mention it here. Now, if we're talking about burn strategies, they also released Misfortune, which is a normal spell that says select one face-up monster your opponent controls. Inflict damage to your opponent equal to half that monster's original attack. Your monster cannot attack this turn. So if you're playing a more devoted burn deck, where you don't even need to attack, this can be a pretty good effect, but it also does depend on what your opponent has, and so it's not necessarily the best thing in the world, in my opinion, because I think that most burn decks generally want to be operating on a point where, like, they don't care what their opponent does, they're just going to win the game through burn. So you don't necessarily want a card like Misfortune, which actually does care what your opponent does. But moving on with more burn, we've also got Destruction of Destiny. This is a normal trap that says send 3 cards from the top of your deck to the graveyard and take 1,000 damage for each spell or trap card sent to the graveyard this way. So if you're playing a spell trap heavy burn deck, potentially deal 3,000 damage off this card. That's kind of neat. It also is sort of like a Proto Needlebug Nest. So if you're playing a deck that wants cards engraved, this can also be good to set up there. So I think this card's actually a pretty cool card. I don't really think it's necessarily worth playing in a burn deck, but it's kind of cool to actually see and talk about here. Last 2 cards in the set. Couldn't think of any good way to tie them to anything else here, so I figure I'll just talk about them here. I don't think they're very good at this point, but they are interesting to talk about at least. First, we got Guard Dog, level 3 Earth Beast Flip monster. Says flip, your opponent cannot special summon for the rest of this turn. I guess I could have tied this in to Searchlight Man or Whirlwind Weasel. So like these cards all like cut off your opponent from doing things after they're flipped. I don't know why that was a sub theme of this archetype, or not archetype, but set. It seems like a really weird sub theme, but you know, I guess it's something here, so I could have tied this into that, I guess. Either way, this card's not really good right now. It will potentially see play much later in the game's history in sort of jank decks, playing cards that can flip it face up and just basically shutting off their opponent's special summons later on. But I don't think this card is that good now. Lastly, we got Shattered Axe, the continuous trap. It says activate this card by targeting one face-up monster on the field. During each of your standby phases, it loses 500 attack. When that target is destroyed, destroy this card. This card's really bad. This card's actively terrible. Like, I don't know why you would play this over any other form of removal. I mean, even if you're just trying to, I don't know what you're doing with this card. Nightmare Wheels is infinitely better if you want to sort of protect yourself from damage. Like Sacrifice to Armor, Widespread Ruin, etc. are better if you want to actually get rid of the card. This card's just really, really bad. I don't see why anyone would play it. But I guess it's a continuous trap for your Riot decks, so maybe that's why you'd play it, but it's not really worth playing anything else. But that's going to do it for Enemy of Justice, and that will do it for all the new cards added into Chaos Return format. I'm pretty sure I got all of them, but if I missed any, let me know down in the comments below. And also let me know what you think about these cards and what strategies you're planning on cooking up for the format. I'm really excited to dive into it. I think this is a very interesting set, Enemy of Justice. It's not necessarily as impactful as some of the sets in the later GX era will be, but I still think it's really cool in the form of like what it introduces to the game and how it changes the way certain decks play. So I really like this set. It's a soft spot in my heart, so I was happy to go through it card by card for y'all. But if you want to see sort of my adventures in Chaos Return format, which will be coming up pretty soon, definitely subscribe to the channel so that way you know when those videos come out. Also, if you want to play games in Chaos Return format or any other format that I featured on the channel, definitely head over to the YGO from Zero Discord server, linked in the description down below. I'll also be holding multiple Chaos Return weeklies there, just local tournaments that happen in one night, so you can play in those, but also we'll be holding a monthly tournament, which will be a bit of a bigger one, multi-day, and so, that should have a bit more flexibility in time if you don't think you can make one night for the locals. So I highly recommend heading over there if you want to play in Chaos Return format. And it's a great place to talk about retro Yu-Gi-Oh! In general as well. But also, if you want to support me directly, I have a Patreon linked in the description down below. And if you join the Patreon, you get a shout out in the videos. So big shout outs to Tyler Compton, GMYFS, Dump Truck, Rincewind, Pork Chop, and Brendan Donker. It really means a lot that you all support me this way. You heard me make more videos like this one. I hope you enjoyed it as always, and I hope that you're excited as I am to dive into Chaos Return format. Until next time, I've been Ben from YGO from Zero, and I'm signing off.